I'm going to explain to you why the vast majority of self help and self improvement books are complete bogus. They might have some tidbits of wisdom here and there. Typically, those or most self help books nowadays take those tidbits of wisdom from somebody else, somebody in the past, a great person of the past. And to give them credit, some of these authors are, most of them, I would say, are very well intentioned. They're not deliberately trying to make your life worse or anything like that. I think they're genuinely trying to help people. So, anybody in the self improvement space, the self help space, I have a tremendous amount of respect for because I do think most of them are actually trying to help people. And it's not just like a grift, right? Or, of course, they're trying to help themselves too because that space is very profitable. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're like evil. That's not the claim I'm making. The reason that it doesn't really self improvement and self help just as an industry, think of the typical guys, the famous people in that industry. So, like Tony Robbins. Um, I don't know. He's just the one that comes to mind, but anybody else. I don't hate Tony Robbins, by the way. But almost all of self improvement and self help has a fundamental error that they're starting off of, that they build off of, that they don't even question. And I think that actually consequently, I should say, consequently, it consequently results in people not achieving their goals or not having a clear understanding of what they're even doing when they're improving. And here's what I mean by that. So, especially if you were raised in America, like I was, or raised in any Western country at this point, because America has influence everywhere, you're sort of brought up on this idea that human beings are fundamentally good. That is actually central to our the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, the guy who wrote it, and a lot of the other founding fathers, they were students of the Enlightenment. This isn't some shocking revelation. If you're paying attention in history class, this is something that you would know. But not only were they inspired by the Enlightenment, a lot of them were inspired by two particular thinkers in general, specifically, I should say, John Locke and Jean Jacques Rousseau, especially Thomas Jefferson. So, John Locke had this idea of natural rights, that human beings were sort of born with this blank slate. We weren't born good or evil, and we became good or evil based on the society that we were raised in. And so there's some very negative, bad implications to this, I should say, but some good implications, I should say, is that there's an emphasis on the importance of childhood being raised in the right environment. I think what we know psychologically now in the modern day, that's definitely true. There's another part to this, though, that's fundamentally sort of the source of all of our problems and self improvement, which I'll get to. And this is more the idea of Rousseau, which Locke seemed to kind of share, is that human beings are naturally good. Again, Locke technically said it was a blank slate, but the implication is that because we're a blank slate, if we're put in the right society, we will be good. That necessarily means that we'll become good. And Rousseau took it even a step further, saying that society is basically what corrupts human beings, and left to not being in a society, be left to your own devices without the anybody else impeding you or impeding your judgments about the world and all that stuff, you would actually be a good person. So this idea of the noble savage, if you weren't a part of civilization society, regardless if it was good or bad, or you were raised right or wrong, you would naturally be good. And not only do I think that this sentiment is laughable, especially with what we know about human beings historically across all different cultures. Keep in mind, even the intellectuals back then, they had access to history from different cultures, but not like every single culture from the entire world, right? Because you could make the case that like maybe there was this demon ideology that was floating around and corrupting the minds of all people because all people had some sort of interaction with one another. But we know for a fact that there's a bunch of people who have been isolated from the rest of humanity for thousands or tens of thousands of years, maybe even more. And they still act in certain ways that are very similar to other societies that haven't interacted with each other at all. So this is something that Carl Jung was famous for. Kind of his idea of the collective unconscious, that we have these sort of the structure of our brain and the way that we derive meaning comes from symbols, and one of the ways that he thought that this was a ubiquitous thing among humans is that, just as evidence, that these historical uh, a lot of these ancient civilizations had very similar stories that they would tell and themes, especially in the religious domain, even though they never had any contact with one another. So it's almost like we have this sort of a bit ability and appreciation of stories a priori, meaning before we're exposed to it in the world, it's just kind of fundamentally a part of our brains. So the founding fathers didn't really have access to this information that we do now. So I'm not faulting them. I think Thomas Jefferson is amazing. Obviously, it wasn't that great that he owned slaves, but it's well, I'll get to that in a second. I think that's a very normal human thing to do, unfortunately. And that's sort of what I'm about to get to, is that this idea that human beings are naturally good, that's been implanted in our minds from a young age. Uh, Again, if you're especially if you're raised in the US. And it's sort of like if you imagine a house. So I used to work construction way back in the day. And I think this is general knowledge too, but when a house is built on a faulty foundation, like so much of construction is focused on just the foundation of the house. And then once the foundation of the house is set, then the rest of the house, it's not too difficult to, or it doesn't take too much time, I should say, to build up. But the foundation takes a lot of time, because if you screw up the foundation, I mean, in a storm and stuff, people could die. The house can, a bunch of bad stuff can happen, right? And I think it's a very similar thing of like where we derive our ethics and our thoughts about life from, more specifically, who we believe ourselves to be. If that's built on a faulty foundation, then we're almost going to be deluded or looking through the wrong lens when we're observing our life and the lives of others, making value judgments of others as well as ourselves, which is essentially what self-improvement is. You're making a value judgment on yourself of, oh, I'm not as good as I should be or can be. Therefore, I must change. There's other people out there that I want to be like. I want to be like them, therefore I should change to become like them. And the sort of false assumption, like I said earlier, is that human beings are naturally good. And we're not naturally good. You open a history textbook, you look at how slavery has been a ubiquitous thing across all societies almost throughout all of history. Again, societies that never even interacted with each other. It's not like one day some genius had this idea of, hey, let's enslave people, and then they spread it around to everybody else, and then it just spread across, and it just became this idea that took hold of humanity. It's like, no, maybe slavery and feeling like you have power over somebody and making somebody weaker than you do something that you want because you're more powerful. Maybe that's how humans actually are. And we're deluding ourselves into thinking that that's not our natural state. Now, you could make the argument that it's the thing that humans should do, and it's a noble cause, is to try to fight against that urge to only seek power and to only dominate and to try to make something greater. This is one thing. Uh, Now, notice I said the founding fathers were influenced by the Enlightenment and not by Christianity, because Christianity, to its credit, says that. It says that we are born of original sin, that we are naturally evil, and only by the grace of God can we be redeemed, right? So at the very least, Christianity has that sort of in place. And there's a lot of other critiques of Christianity that I have personally, as somebody who was a former Catholic, that I can get into. But largely, it's much better than this sort of secular humanist view that human beings are naturally good. Like, automatically, if somebody says that they really thought um, that Rousseau was good, or they think the French Revolution was like the greatest thing ever. I don't necessarily think it's like the worst thing ever, but I don't think it's something that should be like championed because there's a lot of repercussions in the modern day that most people don't really see or understand. But let's look at most modern self help books. It's clearly influenced by Enlightenment philosophy. Not directly, but again, like I stated at the beginning of this video, most self help gurus or self improvement books, their wisdom is derived from the wisdom of past thinkers, which again isn't inherently a bad thing. A lot of my wisdom and my ideas are influenced by past thinkers as well. I just think that the thinkers that that I look up to and I study are a bit more grounded in reality, in the sense that they actually look at human beings for what they really are rather than fantasize about what they could be. I think you have to look at them from what they are first, which is inherently what most people call evil, and then build from there rather than saying, oh, they're just deluding yourself and saying, oh, they're naturally good, and then building up from there. It's a false foundation. So most self-help books, they have this assumption. They might not say it explicitly, like saying human beings are naturally good, but they might say things along the lines of, "Oh, well, everybody's just trying to make it in this world, and really, most people are simple. They just want uh, health, wealth, and the pursuit of happiness." Kind of implicit within that, especially the last part, which is inspired by Thomas Jefferson, they kind of have these Rousseauian and Lockean ideals. I don't know if Lockean is the right way to say it. I guess it would be. He's a little bit less influential than Rousseau worldwide, I would say. And if if that's the case, because that's like a common adage I hear in almost all self-help spaces: health, wealth, and the pursuit of happiness. And it's not that simple because, well, what is happiness? What is the pursuit of happiness? What is wealth? And what is health? you know, I have to make whole separate videos on that. And I'm writing about this stuff in my book. But here's sort of the central thing I want you to take away from this video. What is missing from self-help books? Now that I've sort of laid the foundation of everything, or what I was saying, sort of more the why. What's the thing that's actually missing? It's missing the fact that human beings are inherently aggressive, violent creatures who are very insecure. And because human beings are naturally very insecure, they're going to do things to try to gain power in order to feel better about themselves, about their family, about society. And all of those things are all tied together, because this is another thing that self-help books really mess up on, is they almost ignore societal and familial uh, implications. I mean, that's not the right word to use, but I'm sure you know what I mean. They focus too much on the individual, because when you focus so much on the individual, it gives you sort of this illusion of control, right? But if that was already a false assumption to begin with, along coupled with the false assumption that human beings are naturally good, imagine how unstable the house is that you're going to be building, the house of your life, based on these self-improvement books. It could be potentially disastrous, especially if you're a man, because women are power seeking as well, but men especially are very power seeking. I mean, it's like, why do you think we like sports, right? When you're playing a sport, you are comparing your strength against another opponent who's of equal, greater, or even or just slightly lesser strength, similar strength, and you're trying to compete to see who's better. And every Sunday in the US, all of us gather around our TV screens, at millions of us, to watch this event unfold and watch these teams that represent our local tribe, aka our local city that we live in. So for me, it's the Philadelphia Eagles, even though I don't live in Philly anymore. They're at the time of this recording, they're playing the Dallas Cowboys. I want them to destroy the Dallas Cowboys. But that is sort of a simulation of that warrior culture that we were sort of descended from. It's in our DNA. We're the descendants of a long line of warriors who spread their genes, who raped and pillaged their way to greatness, and we are their descendants. And we just look at our species, Homo sapiens. They exterminated basically the Neanderthal species. So we are inherently warlike. And self help books don't talk about this because it sounds ugly. It sounds disheartening. It doesn't sound very empowering on the surface because it seems like, oh crap, I'm just learning. But I had this nice little lie that I believe for such a long time that I'm a good person and I just want peace and happiness. And if there was no wars and there was just peace and happiness and everyone would be happy, just no wars, peace only, then the world would be great. Imagine, imagine there's no wars. Imagine all the people, whatever that terrible John Lennon song about imagine. That encapsulates the hippie generation, encapsulates every single thing that's wrong with the modern world and how we've deluded ourselves into thinking that we're something that we're not. So in that song, he talks about like, oh, imagine there's no war. Imagine there's no religion. Then everyone would be peaceful hippies like me. Or that other song, the one that goes, oh, huh, huh, war. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. That one too. It's like historically, everybody thought that war was important. And obviously, people changed their minds after the disastrous wars of World War I and World War II. But to just say that war is good for absolutely nothing, what's assumed in that is that we're naturally good, right? If we're naturally good, yes, war is good for nothing. However, if we aren't naturally good, if we're naturally warlike, then we need some sort of war. And if we don't have some sort of war that we're fighting, something to compete against, then we start to attack ourselves. Tyler Durden said it in Fight Club, and Chuck Palahniuk is clearly very influenced by Nietzsche and Carl Jung. He said that we don't have any great war. Our great war is our lives. He was kind of making that speech in Fight Club. The implication being that we're all depressed, nihilistic, and feel purposeless, unlike our grandfathers and our ancestors who had something to fight for and fight against because they had the gift of war. Self help books don't talk about this because let's be honest, most of it's tailored toward women. And I think women, if they're honest about their assessment of men and masculinity, they'll understand this sort of warlike proclivity that we have. But also, women have sort of a different role or a different psychology, I would say. I'm going to cover about this more in my book, and I probably will in some of these videos here too. But just from now on, whenever you read any self help or self improvement book and they don't talk about the need for competitiveness with men and they don't make it explicitly clear that human beings aren't naturally good, that we have these sort of proclivities or these tendencies to do what most people would call evil, then they're just blowing smoke up your ass. They are. It might be a useful lie, it might be a useful delusion, but that's exactly what it is. And I'll leave with one more thing. There's sort of this assumption that everybody has that war and peace are kind of diametrically opposed to each other. I think war and peace are completely intertwined because if we are inherently warlike, then we are not at peace when we are at peace. And if we're inherently warlike, then oddly enough, we're at peace when we're at war. That's all I gotta say about this video. See you tomorrow.